Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 418. I'm Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on the show today, but first I just want to mention you can find the show at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show, and you can check out the show anywhere you listen to audio podcasts. One last plug before we get into it, and that is for everybody to head on over to antiwar.com and help us out. We're holding a fundraiser. Right now we have matching funds, so every dollar that you donate will be doubled. Even if you can only get $5-10, that becomes 10-20 bucks, which is awesome. And also, we thrive off small dollar donations. And so, it's everybody coming in, giving us $5-10. We don't have, major backers that dictate how we put out content or anything like that at antiwar.com. It's all about, being the truth opposed to U.S. empire. And, that requires a lot of individual donations. So head on over antiwar.com, make a donation. I really appreciate it. And let's get into the show. First story today. Australia's Prime Minister frustrated U.S. won't drop charges against Julian Assange. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has expressed frustration with the Biden administration over efforts to convict Wikileaks founder Julian Assange, an Australian citizen. There is nothing being served by his ongoing incarceration, Albanese said Friday while in the UK. The Australian leader noted Assange has already spent years incarcerated as he has been in the London's Belmarsh prison since April 2019 and has been confined to the Ecuadorian embassy before that. I just say that enough is enough, he said. I know it's frustrating. I share the frustration. I can't do more than make it very clear what my position is. And the U.S. administration is certainly very aware of what the Australian government's position is. Last November, Odysee personally asked the U.S. government to drop charges against Assange, who is facing up to 175 years in prison if convicted for publishing information revealed U.S. war crimes. The Biden administration has been under increasing pressure to end its attempt to extradite Assange from the UK, but shows no sign it's willing to change course. On May 3rd, which marked World Press Freedom Day, the State Department refused to acknowledge that Assange was a journalist and passed charges against him for the first time. Previously, the State Department would not comment on the case. A group of House Democrats, led by Rashida Tlaib, recently sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland urging him to drop charges against Assange. The WikiLeaks founder used standard journalistic practices to obtain the information he published, and the lawmakers warned that his conviction could set a precedent. The prosecution of Mr. Assange, if successful, not only sets a legal precedent whereby journalists or publishers can be prosecuted, but a political one as well. In the future, the New York Times or Washington Post could be prosecuted when they publish important stories based on classified information, the lawmakers said in their letter. So this is good news. The more we had the Australian Prime Minister speaking out, the better. This is a very high-profile politician here. Now, the problem is, when you look at the Australian-U.S. relationship, you would think that if Albanese really wanted to do this, he may have had the opportunity, as the U.S. has started to use Australia more as a military base over the past couple of years, particularly with the eye on China. We have the AUKUS agreement, the quadrilateral dialogue, all these things. And if Albanese wanted to, maybe he could leverage Australia's membership to get Assange free. If you want to be able to maintain your nuclear submarines in Australia, then you have to free this journalist. But we're not seeing that. So maybe this is a little bit more rhetorical from the Australian Prime Minister. He's receiving some political pressure at home, so he's making these statements. But in reality, he's really not willing to do what needs to be done to get Assange freed. So it could be some good news here. Could be just some rhetoric, but all the same, anybody who's talking about Assange at a high-profile level gets his name in the news, and that's what we need. He's been in jail for 4 years now in the UK, and it doesn't seem like anybody's in a real hurry to get him into a courtroom where he's actually going to face the charges that he's accused of in the U.S. I guess his legal team doesn't want him to go to the U.S., but it also seems like the government in London is very committed to just, kind of keeping him shacked up there and going through the legal system, these motions and appeals and all this, because if he's in jail, WikiLeaks has its hands tied. All right, now let's move on to this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on May the 4th, titled Pentagon Inks Multi-Billion-Dollar Contract with Lockheed Raytheon for Javelin Missiles. Here we go. The Pentagon has ordered more Javelin anti-tank missiles manufactured by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin as Washington's stockpiles dwindle. Taipei is due to receive hundreds of the weapon systems next year, and the White House has already sent thousands to Kiev. Lockheed and Raytheon's contract is to produce an indefinite quantity of Javelins over 3 years in a deal that could be worth as much as $7.2 billion. The weapons makers jointly produce the anti-tank weapon. Missiles will be distributed to the Army, Marines, Navy, as well as international customers. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the White House sent thousands of Javelin missiles to Ukraine. 2 months into the war, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, assessed that the U.S. sent about 7,000 Javelins to Ukraine, about 1/3 of the U.S. stockpile. Over the past year, that number has grown to about 8,500. So in the initial days of the war, they were sending thousands of these. Ukraine was apparently using 500 or so a day at one point. But since, I guess because the stockpiles dwindled so much, the U.S. started sending other weapons. They've only sent about 1,500 of the Javelins over the past year versus, again, 7,000 in the first 2 months of the war. Lockheed Martin is working to increase production to about 4,000 Javelin missiles per year, according to Doug Bush, the head of acquisitions for the Army. He claimed that the contract shows American equipment to boosting the weapons production. Each missile costs from $160,000 to $180,000. I think there's some different variants of it, and I'm not quite exactly sure what's going to Ukraine and what's going to Taiwan. The Army, along with industry partners, are striving to shorten the production lead time associated with the production and delivery of these systems, Bush said. The contract awarded further illustrates the urgency the U.S. government is applying to acquisition of systems and replenishing munitions stockpiles. In addition to filling America and Ukrainian stockpiles, Taiwan is set to receive 400 of the anti-tank missiles during the next 2 years. And then there was also a sale of Javelins, 125 million worth, approved to the UK recently. And so it's unclear kind of what order people are going to be waiting in line. Army, Marines, Taiwan, UK, Ukraine, all are requesting these weapons. With the American stockpiles being nearly depleted, it's not clear if the Americans are going to get them first, the Taiwanese are going to get them first, because there's a lot in Congress advocating for that. Or if, it's going to be the UK or, where these things end up going is still a mystery. But that is a lot of our money going to Lockheed and Raytheon. Next up here, Wagner head says Moscow promised more arms after threats to leave Bakhmut. The head of the Russian mercenary outfit Wagner Group said he was promised his fighters would get as much ammunition as weapons as needed to continue fighting in Bakhmut. The assurances from Moscow came after the Wagner Group head said his forces would withdraw from Bakhmut on May 10th over a lack of support. The threat to quit the battle came after the head of the group posted a video on Telegram where he slammed the Russian military's leadership and showed dozens of corpses of Wagner fighters. According to Russia Today, in a voice note posted on Telegram on Sunday, the group said he received a military instruction in which we are promised ammunition and weapons as we need to continue our activities. Now, this is very interesting to me because I guess, this is maybe my assumption, and maybe I'm assuming things that I shouldn't be assuming here. However, Putin seems like a fairly strong man and would have the ability to tell Wagner what to do. and would also be able to, kind of upend the organization if it wasn't doing what he wanted. And so the fact that you've had several times now the head of the Wagner group come out and just say, we're going to pull out of this region if the Russian army doesn't give us more weapons, it's kind of interesting that, these conversations aren't happening behind closed doors, and that the Wagner group seems to use it and then get more weapons from Russia. Now, maybe there's some kind of 3D chess that I don't understand what's going on here exactly, and maybe the Russians are doing this because they're trying to change the Ukrainian forces tactics for some reason. It's unclear, but it's very interesting that this happens again and again, and it looks like Ukraine is going to get more weapons. Dave DeCamp here in his article notes that Wagner has been doing much of the fighting in Bakhmut, and the head of the group has been increasingly critical of Russia's military leadership as his forces have taken heavy losses. Russia controls the vast majority of Bakhmut, but Ukrainian forces are still holding on to the western edges of the city. Ukrainian soldiers have also complained about the lack of support from their military leadership. Ukrainians fighting on the front lines have said that fresher groups were being poured into the Battle of Bakhmut, which has become known as a meat grinder with little training and ammunition. So Bakhmut and the whole war in Ukraine is a disgusting mess, and a lot of people are unnecessarily dying. Next up, prominent Russian novelist injured in Delhi car bombing. Zakhar Perlipin, a prominent Russian novelist and supporter of the Russia's war in Ukraine, was injured in a deadly car bombing in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod Oblast on Saturday. And so, this is interesting. He wasn't killed. We have Daria Dugina, who was killed. We have another Russian blogger Tartarsky, who was killed in a cafe bombing last month. And so this would be kind of the third assassination target at a Russian nationalist who is supportive of the war inside of Russia. Always questions about what could possibly be going on here. Maybe this was an attack by Ukraine. Maybe it wasn't. My guess is, given what we've seen recently, this probably was a Ukrainian attack. And this is something I talked about in the show, I think last week, but maybe the week before, that it does seem there is maybe a change in the Ukrainian tactics. Rather than launching the expected counteroffensive to retake territory, Ukraine is going with more asymmetrical style attacks. So explosions, derailing freight trains inside of Russia, shelling Russian villages, again, inside of Russian territory, attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, assassination attempts, maybe even taking a shot at President Putin with a drone. All these things that have happened recently when we would kind of expect the counteroffensive to be ongoing. And you do wonder that if maybe Ukraine has lost so many resources in Bakhmut during that battle that they don't have the troops, the ammunition, the armor needed for a real counteroffensive. And so, again, I think it would, from if you're the Ukrainian general and you're kind of dealt these cards and you're asked what to do, well, you probably take up defensive positions and then start carrying out asymmetrical style attacks, carrying out, shelling of Russian villages, same soft civilian targets, assassination attempts, things like that. So this is really concerning, could lead to a massive escalation in this war. My understanding is Russia carried out a pretty heavy bombing of Ukraine again last night. All right, so next up here, Russia evacuates people near Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is the ZNPP. Russia-backed authorities in Ukraine's southern Zaporizhzhia Oblast have ordered an evacuation from areas that are threatened with shelling a town near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the ZNPP. The Russian installed acting governor of Zaporizhzhia said about 70,000 people in 18 towns and villages would be relocated due to intensified shelling. The evacuation order comes as Ukraine is expected to launch a counteroffensive that is expected to be focused on taking control of Russian-controlled territory in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. We believe that a counteroffensive will begin very soon. We have information that the line of contact up to 150 kilometers deep, and we will realize that could happen in the coming days, if not hours. And so I guess they expect heavy shelling in the region, and of course the threat here is that this is the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. and we could see a major catastrophe coming if this thing is severely damaged. So let's hope that doesn't happen, but something definitely to keep an eye on. This is really interesting. This hasn't come up in months and months. So Turkey rejects U.S. request to send S-400 air defense systems to Ukraine. So this is really a years-long story that we have been covering on this show, where in, I think, 2017, Turkey said that they were going to buy S-400 missiles from Russia. These are an air defense system that I think is comparable to the American Patriot system. So these are fairly advanced. Both India and I believe Turkey chose to buy the S-400 over the Patriot air defense system. And so we've had since the start of since 2017, we've had Americans threatening to sanction Turkey over it. I think there may have been some sanctions applied. Turkey was kicked out of the F-35 program over it. And the U.S. says, we need integrated air defenses. So in NATO, so if Turkey has the S-400, this becomes a problem with Turkey also having the F-35. Now, since the war in Ukraine has started, the U.S. has pressured Ankara on several occasions to go ahead and give the S-400 systems to Ukraine. And I guess this would really be a move that would upset the Kremlin, right? They sold these very advanced systems to a NATO country, and then they were then used against Russian planes or something like that. And so the Turkish foreign minister said that Turkey has rejected a U.S. request for Ankara to provide Kiev with Russian-made S-400 missile defense systems it purchased from Moscow in 2017. The foreign minister said the U.S. proposal violated Turkey's sovereignty and suggested Washington also asked Ankara to hand over the Russian-made system to the U.S. They made proposals that directly affect our sovereignty. For example, give us control over it, give it to another place. Where's our independence and our sovereignty? The U.S. has hit Turkey with sanctions in 2020 over the purchase of the S-400, a step that significantly deteriorated U.S.-Turkey relations. And, this is interesting, as Turkey does have an election coming up soon. The Voice of America, an American propaganda outlet, this is a U.S. government-funded outlet, put out a little video on the main challenger to Erdogan and in this coming election in, a week or two now, and the challenger says that he is going to be more pro-Western. And this was like very flattering coverage. So it's interesting to me because it definitely seems like the U.S. is looking at the situation with Erdogan, and thinking of the possibility that, maybe we want to back his opposition. Another interesting thing that has happened is the Turkish political parties in Turkey, which the U.S., I would imagine, has a good amount of leverage over because of the war in Ukraine. The U.S. has backed the Ukrainian, it's not the war in Syria, not the war in Ukraine. For a decade now, the U.S. has backed the Syrian Kurds and provided them with a lot of weapons. And the YPG is closely linked to the PKK. Turkey says the YPG, which is the Syrian Kurds, are basically just a small offshoot of the PKK, the Turkish Kurds. My guess is that Turkey overstates it a little bit, but at the same time, there are a lot of ties there. And one of the things that kind of happens in Turkish politics is you have two candidates who run that are Turks, right? And just more traditional Muslims than the Kurds. And then you have the Kurds who run their own campaign. And this is kind of like a Palestinian situation in Israel where they never get enough votes to really do anything. But at the same time, they are maybe able to elect a couple members of parliament or something like that. Well, it seems to me that the Kurds, my understanding is they're not going to run anybody in the presidential race. And this would seemingly give a bump to Erdogan's political opposition, because they would be likely to take those votes and not Erdogan's party. And this was attempted in, I want to say, the 2020 election for the Istanbul governor, which I guess is kind of a bellwether type of election in Turkey. And it at least created a lot of problems. I think Erdogan actually held a second election to make sure that his candidate got elected. So we can see some very interesting things coming out of Turkey in the next month. I definitely think it's something that we'll be paying attention to on the show, and everybody should, keep an eye out when they're reading the news. All right, before we wrap up here, I got China and Sudan news left. U.S. Philippines make defense commitment in South China Sea. The U.S. and Philippines on Wednesday agreed on new guidelines for the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty that formalized the U.S. commitment to going to war if the Philippines vessels come under attack in the South China Sea. For years now, U.S. officials have pledged to the Philippines that it would intervene in the event of a Chinese attack in the South China Sea, but Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. came to Washington this week looking to put that commitment in writing. The guidelines are the first update to the Mutual Defense Treaty since 1951 and specify that the treaty applies to the South China Sea, where China and the Philippines have overlapping territorial claims. The guidelines reaffirm that an armed attack on the Philippines, including anywhere in the South China Sea, on either their public vessels, aircraft, or armed forces, which includes their Coast Guard, would invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty under Article 4 and 5 of the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, the Pentagon said. The Pentagon said the guidelines are also take into account threats may arise in several domains, including land, sea, airspace, and cyberspace, and take the form of asymmetric, hybrid, and integrated warfare and gray zone tactics. The guidelines chart a way forward to build interoperability in both conventional and non-conventional domains. And this is something that could be a real problem here, because the U.S. is constantly claiming that, China hacked here, China did this, China did that. And in the cybersecurity space, I think it's very hard for the public to understand what's going on and to get the evidence, because all the evidence is going to come through the U.S. government. And as we know, the U.S. government could lie, cover things up. And so this is really concerning, the way they've altered this treaty. Just to finish up the article here, the new commitments come amid soaring tensions between Beijing and the South China Sea countries. Ahead of Marcos' trip to Washington, Chinese and Philippines vessels came close to colliding near Second Thomas Shoal, a Philippines-controlled reef in the South China Sea. That is also claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And so this is one of the interesting things to me about this, the U.S. asserting that this is where we stand on the Mutual Defense Treaty, is because we have other countries that were either trying to court or are very much in the Americans' pocket that also say they have, claim to this territory. And so would the USA go to war with Taipei if they were to try to take over this shoal? Next up here, NATO to open office in Japan, the alliance's first in Asia. This from Dave DeCamp, May 4th, antiwar.com. NATO is planning to open a liaison office in Japan next year, the alliance's first in Asia. In recent years, NATO has turned its gaze towards the Asia-Pacific region and named China as a systematic challenge in the 2022 strategic concept. As a part of its strategy against China, the alliance is deepening its cooperation with countries in the region. The purpose of the liaison office in Japan is to allow the military alliance to conduct periodic consultations with Japan and key partners in the region such as South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand as China emerges as a new challenge alongside its traditional focus on Russia. The report said NATO and Japan will take more steps to increase cooperation by signing an agreement known as the Individual Tailored Partnership Program ahead of the NATO summit that will be held in Lithuania in June. Japan also plans to open an independent mission in NATO separate from its embassy in Belgium. In response to the news, China warned NATO that its plans to expand to Asia. Asia is an anchor for peace and stability and promising land for cooperation and development, not wrestling ground for geopolitical competition, the Chinese Foreign Minister Mao Ning said. She added, NATO continued eastward foray into the Asia-Pacific and interference in regional affairs will inevitably undermine regional peace and stability and stoke camp confrontation. This calls for high vigilance among regional countries. So this is concerning. Not only are we very much embroiled in the war in Ukraine, but now we are really looking to expand in this Cold War and maybe even turning into a hot war with China over Taiwan. Last up here before we wrap up, there is all this conflict and confrontation going on and in Sudan. And so now we have the Biden administration approving an order to impose sanctions on Sudan. President Biden on Thursday signed an executive order expanding his authorities to impose sanctions on Sudan over the conflict that broke out between rival generals on April 15th. Forces loyal to Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudan's army chief and de facto leader, had been fighting with the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemati. The two military leaders have agreed to several ceasefires, but the fighting has not stopped. In a statement, Biden said the conflict in Sudan must end. He gave orders. His orders give him sweeping authority to sanction any person or entity the U.S. determines is involved in activities that threaten peace, security, and stability in Sudan. The order said the situation in Sudan, including military seizures of power in October 2021 and the outbreak of inter-service fighting in April 23, constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. This is the part where it gets ridiculous. I mean, look, I'm obviously opposed to the U.S. sanctioning Sudan, even if they just sanction the two military leaders here. Whoever ends up on top will be sanctioned, and that'll hurt all the people in Sudan. But to claim this impacts the national security and foreign policy of the United States is just stupid and ridiculous, and are words that the Democrats are using to make it sound to the American people that they have a real cause to be sanctioning Sudan when they do not. The order said that it is U.S. policy to support a transition to democracy and civilian transitional government in Ukraine, and to defend such transitional government from those who would prevent its initial formation through violence. And this is, I think, another major problem here, right? Where you're saying that Sudan is a country that has to have a democratic government. Well, who knows how many regime changes, how many generals are going to go through, how many Sudanese people are going to die over how many years before there's even a possibility of having a government like that emerge. And once it does emerge, there's no guarantee that it's not going to be just as corrupt and just as brutal as any military government would be. But yet the United States is saying that if Sudan doesn't go along with this, their people are going to be starved to death under U.S. sanctions. So last up here, the Pentagon has been helping evacuate people from Sudan, and so far over 1,000 American citizens have left. On Thursday, the Pentagon said the role for U.S. troops in the country is to set the change as the U.S. expects the fighting to continue, but declined to say what the changes will be. 3 U.S. naval ships are off the coast of Sudan, and one has been transporting people across the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in today. That's where I'm wrapping up the show. Again, if you can, head on over to antiwar.com and make a donation. Thank you all so much for tuning in.